The train's whistle shrieked through the Montana air like a banshee's wail. And Eliza Morgan stepped onto the snow-crusted platform just as 3 masked riders burst from the alley beside the station house. Their horses' hooves struck sparks from the frozen ground as they thundered toward the freight car, guns drawn and voices raised in savage demands. Everyone down now. The lead rider's voice cut through the bitter wind like a blade. Station master, open that strongbox or we'll ventilate your skull. Passengers scattered like startled quail, diving behind luggage and scrambling for cover behind the wooden benches. But Eliza stood frozen, her worn carpet bag clutched against her chest, watching in horror as one of the bandits grabbed a young mother, trying to shield her crying infant. Please, the woman begged, don't hurt my baby. The bandit laughed, a sound like grinding glass. Give us what we want, and maybe we won't. His words ended in a grunt of surprise as Eliza's carpetbag caught him square in the face. She had moved without thinking, driven by an instinct deeper than fear, the same instinct that had carried her 2,000 miles from Philadelphia in search of a new beginning. Leave her alone, Eliza shouted, pulling the woman and child behind the ticket booth as bullets began to fly. The station erupted in chaos. The station master fumbled with his keys while lead slugs splintered the wood around his head. Passengers screamed and prayed, pressing themselves flat against the platform as the gunfight raged. But Eliza had eyes only for the mother and child cowering beside her, their faces white with terror. Stay down, she whispered, shielding them with her own body, as a stray bullet shattered the window above their heads, showering them with glass. The battle lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours before the thunder of hoofbeats announced the bandits' retreat. They vanished into the swirling snow as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind broken glass, scattered luggage, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. As the smoke cleared and people began to emerge from hiding, Eliza helped the young mother to her feet. The woman's eyes were bright with tears of gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. You saved our lives. But Eliza barely heard her. Across the platform, she had spotted a familiar figure, tall and lean as a fence post standing by the freight car, with his jaw set hard as granite. Thomas Parker matched the daguerreotype tucked inside her glove perfectly, but when their eyes met across the chaos, his expression shifted from nervous anticipation to something else entirely. Disgust mixed with disbelief. He approached with measured steps, each one seeming to cost him effort. Around them, other passengers were being embraced by waiting families, their joyful reunions, a stark contrast to the growing circle of curious onlookers who sensed drama unfolding. You're Eliza Morgan. His voice carried the weight of accusation rather than welcome. Yes, Mr. Parker. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her hands trembled as she reached for the letters, his letters tucked safely in her coat pocket. 3 months of correspondence, each one signed with promises of affection and a future built together. I got your last letter, the one where you said, I know what I wrote. Thomas's laugh was bitter as winter's sage. But I also expected honesty in return. Your photograph, your description of yourself. You lied about everything that mattered. Heat flooded Eliza's cheeks, but the cold air turned it to burning ice. She could hear the whispers starting, feel the weight of stares from people who had just witnessed her moment of courage and were now being treated to her public humiliation. I never lied about anything important. She managed her voice barely audible above the wind. My letters were true. My feelings were real. Thomas gestured at her fuller figure with undisguised disgust. Look at you. I won't be tied to someone who deceived me from the start. You're too... He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air between them anyway. Too fat. Too much. Too different from what I ordered. The platform seemed to tilt beneath Eliza's feet. The letters in her pocket, letters filled with dreams of frontier life, of a man who wrote about wanting a woman with strength of character and warmth of heart, suddenly felt like lead weights dragging her down. Please, she whispered, hating herself for begging, but seeing no alternative. I have nowhere else to go. I used everything I had just to get here. That's your problem, not mine. Thomas turned his back on her and walked toward a weathered man loading supplies into a wagon. Pa, I'm ready to head home. Harold Parker looked up from securing a barrel of flour, his gray eyes moving from his son to the young woman standing alone beside her carpet bag. At 63, he carried himself with the steady grace of a man who had survived too many hard winters to be easily rattled. His weathered face had seen the entire confrontation, the courage Eliza had shown during the robbery, and the cruelty his son was showing now. What about Miss Morgan? Harold's voice was carefully neutral, but something in his tone made Thomas stiffen. There is no Miss Morgan, Thomas said loudly enough for half the platform to hear. Just a woman who thought she could trick a man into marriage with pretty letters and old photographs. Harold's jaw tightened. The boy's mother would have taken a switch to him for such cruelty, and the memory of Sarah's gentle strength made Harold's decision for him. He had watched this young woman risk her life to save strangers during the robbery. That spoke to character in ways that appearance never could. Thomas, get in the wagon. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had built a ranch from nothing and raised a son through 2 decades of frontier hardship. But you can't seriously. Get in the wagon, now. Something in Harold's tone brooked no argument. Thomas climbed onto the wagon seat with obvious reluctance, his face dark with anger and embarrassment. Harold approached Eliza with the careful courtesy he would show any wounded creature. Miss Morgan, I'm Harold Parker. I apologize for my son's behavior. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not a lady who just saved lives during a robbery. Eliza looked up at him through tears she was trying desperately not to shed. His face was kind-lined with years of honest work and prairie wind, and she could see where Thomas had gotten his height and the strong line of his jaw. But where Thomas's features held coldness, Harold's radiated warmth. I don't know what to do, she admitted. I used everything I had to get here. I don't even have enough for a return ticket. Harold glanced at the darkening sky, where thick clouds were gathering with the promise of serious snow. The wind was picking up, carrying the bite of the blizzard he could feel in his bones. No one should be left alone in what was coming, let alone a young woman who had just shown such courage. We need help at the ranch, he said, making the decision as he spoke. Kitchen work cooking for the hands. It's honest work with room and board. Would that suit you until you can figure out what comes next? Hope flickered in Eliza's chest, fragile as a candle flame. You don't even know me, Mr. Parker. I know enough. Harold picked up her carpet bag before she could protest. I know you're brave enough to face down armed bandits to save a mother and child. I know you traveled 2,000 miles on faith and hope. That's worth something in my book. As Harold helped her into the wagon, Eliza caught sight of a piece of paper that had fallen from her bag during the scuffle. She quickly retrieved it, a note in unfamiliar handwriting that simply read, Remember what we discussed. The Parker woman arrives today. E.M. Strange. She didn't recognize the handwriting, and she had no idea who E.M. might be. The note must have gotten mixed in with her papers somehow during the journey. She tucked it back into her bag, too overwhelmed by her current situation to worry about a stray piece of paper. The ride to the Parker ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the howling wind and the steady creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground. Thomas sat rigid beside his father, radiating disapproval like heat from a stove, while Eliza huddled in the back with the supplies. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that promised to pile high and stay long. When they finally reached the ranch, Eliza was struck by its size and obvious prosperity. The main house was built of logs and stone that spoke of permanence and careful planning, surrounded by outbuildings that could shelter cattle through the harshest winters. It was more than she had imagined from Thomas's modest descriptions in his letters. and she felt her inadequacy settle around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. 3 ranch hands emerged from the barn as they pulled up to the house. The oldest, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat into the snow when Harold introduced her. "Boys, this is Miss Morgan," Harold announced as he helped her down from the wagon. "She'll be helping in the kitchen. I expect you to treat her with the same respect you'd show any lady." "Sure thing, boss." The grizzled one, Buck, drawled his emphasis, making it clear what he thought of her claim to that title. "Same respect as any lady." But it was the youngest hand who caught Eliza's attention. Jim couldn't have been more than 20 with the kind of nervous energy that came from carrying secrets. When she met his eyes, he quickly looked away, color rising in his cheeks. "Jim here's been with us about 6 months," Harold said, noticing her attention. "Good worker when he puts his mind to it." "Yes, sir," Jim mumbled, still not meeting her gaze. I'll help get your things inside, Miss Morgan." Something about his tone made her skin crawl, but she couldn't put her finger on what. She filed the observation away, focusing instead on following Harold into the house. The interior took her breath away. The front room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace with furniture that spoke of Sarah Parker's careful touch. Photographs lined the mantel, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and the same gentle strength Eliza could see in Harold's face. "My Sarah," Harold said softly, following her gaze. "Died 3 winters ago. Fever took her quick, which was a blessing, I suppose. She always said the kitchen was the heart of a home." He led her to that kitchen, which was larger than any she'd ever worked in. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, while shelves lined with preserves and supplies spoke of a household accustomed to feeding many mouths through long winters. "Rooms upstairs," Harold said, setting her bag at the foot of the narrow stairs. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm and private. Can you handle breakfast before dawn and supper at 6? "Yes, sir. I'm a good cook, Mr. Parker. I won't disappoint you." Harold's smile was genuine, the first she'd received since stepping off the train. "I'm sure you won't. Sarah always said you could tell a person's character by how they treated others when they had nothing to gain by kindness. What you did today at the station, that spoke well of you." That night, Eliza lay awake in the small room under the eaves, listening to the wind howl around the house and the sound of snow pelting the windows. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas and Harold's voices raised in argument, though she couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She knew she was the subject of their disagreement. What she couldn't know was that 3 miles away, Edgar Matheson was standing at his study window, watching the storm build and receiving a report from one of his men. "The robbery went as planned, boss," the man said, still breathing hard from his ride through the snow. "Caused enough chaos to cover our real purpose." Jim got a good look at the Parkers' setup during the confusion. Matheson smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. At 55, he had the kind of hard-earned prosperity that came from taking what he wanted and crushing anyone who got in his way. His land was extensive, his cattle numerous, and his influence in the territory considerable. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. And the woman, the one Thomas was supposed to marry, fat as a house and twice as ugly. The man laughed. Thomas threw her over right there on the platform, but Harold took her in anyway, stubborn old fool. Interesting. Matheson turned from the window, his mind already working through the implications. Harold Parker had always been his greatest obstacle in this valley, too honest to be bought, too well respected to be easily intimidated. But every man had a weakness, and this unexpected house guest might provide the leverage he'd been seeking. The Parker spread sat right in the middle of what should have been his empire, a stubborn holdout that had frustrated him for years. He and Harold had been partners once, back when they were both young men with dreams bigger than their bank accounts. They had worked their first cattle drive together, shared the risks and profits equally. But success had poisoned their friendship. Harold had married Sarah and settled into contentment, while Edgar had chosen a different path, one that led to wealth built on intimidation and questionable land deals. When Harold had discovered Edgar's methods and demanded they dissolve their partnership, Edgar had never forgotten the sense of betrayal and loss. Now, with the roads about to be cut off and the sheriff snowed in 40 miles away, he saw his opportunity to settle old scores and claim what should have been his all along. Jim's positioned perfectly. Matheson mused, studying the maps spread across his desk. Red marks showed where Parker's fences ran, and blue marks showed where Matheson believed they should run instead. Young, scared, and desperate enough to follow orders. The girl's presence just makes everything more complicated for Harold. More to worry about, more to protect. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a leather folder containing deed surveys and legal documents that would support his claim to the disputed land once the current occupants were no longer in a position to contest them. Some of the papers were authentic, dating back to his original partnership with Harold. Others were more recent creations, carefully forged to fill in the gaps that would make his claim ironclad. Storm like this could last for days, he murmured to himself. Cut-off roads mean no witnesses, no interference from town law, and no help coming from neighbors. Time to collect on some old debts. Dawn broke gray and bitter over the Parker ranch, with snow still falling steadily from a sky that promised no mercy. Eliza was already up her breath, visible in the cold kitchen air as she stoked the fire and began preparing breakfast. She had slept poorly, haunted by strange dreams and the persistent feeling that she was being watched. The feeling intensified when Jim appeared in the kitchen doorway, earlier than the other hands, and moving with nervous energy. "Morning, Miss Morgan," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Thought I'd check if you needed any wood for the stove." "That's kind of you, Jim." She studied his face, trying to understand why he made her so uncomfortable. "You're up early?" "I couldn't sleep. Storms got me worried." He moved closer, and she caught a whiff of something on his clothes, not the usual scent of horses and hay, but something sharper. Gunpowder, maybe. "Been thinking about what you said yesterday?" Eliza frowned. "I don't recall saying anything to you yesterday." Jim's face went pale, then red. "I meant... That is, I heard you talking to Mr. Parker about being grateful for shelter. Made me think about my own situation, how lucky I am to have work." There was something wrong with his explanation. But before Eliza could pursue it, Harold entered the kitchen with Thomas close behind. Both men looked like they'd been up most of the night, their faces grim with worry. "Morning, Miss Morgan," Harold said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Hope the storm didn't keep you awake." "Not the storm, no." She glanced meaningfully at Jim, who quickly excused himself to tend the horses. Thomas remained silent, but she noticed him watching her with something that might have been curiosity rather than hostility. The change was subtle but unmistakable, as if her actions during the robbery had forced him to reconsider his initial judgment. "We've got trouble brewing," Harold said quietly, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Found tracks in the snow this morning, fresh ones despite the storm." "How many riders?" Thomas asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Hard to say. 6, maybe 7. They circled the property twice, real careful-like, studying our defenses." Harold's weathered hands tightened around his coffee cup. "Fence posts have been cut too. Clean work done with purpose." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You think it's connected to the robbery yesterday?" "Could be. Or it could be Edgar Matheson finally making his move." Harold's voice carried decades of accumulated tension. "He's been circling this place like a buzzard for years, waiting for his chance." "Who's Edgar Matheson?" Eliza asked. Father and son exchanged a look heavy with history. It was Thomas who answered, his voice carefully controlled. "Someone who used to be Pa's friend. Long time ago, before I was born. They were partners in the cattle business, built their first herds together." "What happened?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee, as if it held answers to questions he'd rather not face. Edgar wanted more than the land could give. Started making deals with railroad men, buying up homesteads with money that didn't always come clean. When I found out what he was doing, I tried to talk sense into him. And when that didn't work, I ended our partnership. Took my cattle and started over here. Harold's voice was heavy with old pain. Edgar never forgave me for that. Said I'd betrayed him when he needed me most. Maybe he was right in his way. But I couldn't be part of what he was becoming. The kitchen fell silent, except for the whistle of wind through the eaves. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Eliza could see the storm building to something truly fierce. If he's planning something, she said carefully, shouldn't we warn the sheriff? Thomas laughed bitterly. Sheriff's 40 miles away in Billings, probably snowed in for a week or more. Even if we could get word to him, Matheson's got half the territorial judges in his pocket. Legal ways don't work against a man like that. Then what do? We prepare for war, Harold said simply. Because that's what this is going to be. The day passed in tense preparation. Harold and Thomas rode the boundaries, checking for signs of further intrusion, while the ranch hands secured the livestock and gathered supplies. Eliza threw herself into cooking, preparing food that could last for days if they were cut off from town. But it was while she was working in the root cellar gathering preserves for the evening meal that she made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a loose stone in the cellar wall, she found a metal strongbox. Inside were documents, land deeds, surveys, and correspondence dating back 20 years. But it was a particular letter that made her blood run cold. The handwriting was familiar, in the same script as the mysterious note that had fallen from her bag. But this letter was signed, Edgar Matheson. Harold, it read, "Our partnership may be ended, but our business isn't finished. You took something that belonged to both of us, and someday I'll take something that belongs to you. Consider this fair warning. A man's got to protect what's his, even if it means destroying what isn't. Your old friend E.M." The letter was dated 3 months ago, exactly when Thomas had begun corresponding with her. Eliza's hands shook as the implications hit her. The note in her bag hadn't been a mistake. Someone had planted it there, someone who knew she was coming to the Parker Ranch. The robbery at the train station hadn't been random. It had been a reconnaissance mission, a way to study the Parker family's reactions and defenses. And Jim's nervous behavior suddenly made terrible sense. She climbed out of the cellar with the letter clutched in her hand, her mind racing. Harold and Thomas were still out checking the boundaries, but she could hear voices in the barn. Jim talking to someone in low, urgent tones. Moving carefully, she crept close enough to hear their conversation through the thin walls. "Told you to wait," Jim was saying, his voice tight with fear. "Mr. Parker's suspicious already. If he catches us, he won't catch us if you do your job right," came the reply in a voice she didn't recognize. "Matheson's getting impatient. The storm won't last forever, and he wants this finished before the roads open." "I can't do it," Jim said, his voice breaking. "These people trusted me. Harold Parker gave me work when nobody else would. I can't just—" "You can and you will." The stranger's voice cut him off. "Unless you want your sister to pay for your conscience. Matheson knows where she works in Helena. Pretty girl like that all alone. Accidents happen." There was a long silence, then Jim's voice hollow with defeat. "What do you want me to do? Tonight, when they're all asleep, you unlock the doors. Leave them open and make sure the guns are hidden where they can't get to them quick. We'll do the rest." Eliza backed away from the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to warn Harold and Thomas, but they wouldn't be back for hours. By then, it might be too late. She was still trying to figure out what to do when she heard the sound of horses approaching through the storm. But instead of Harold and Thomas returning, she saw 3 riders she didn't recognize making their way toward the house. Matheson's advance guard had arrived. Eliza ran for the house, but she was too late. The riders had already dismounted and were spreading out around the property with the practiced efficiency of men who knew their business. Through the kitchen window, she watched them take positions, one by the barn, one near the bunkhouse, and the third moving toward the front door. She was trapped, moving as quietly as possible. She gathered every weapon she could find: Harold's rifle from above the fireplace, ammunition from his desk drawer, the old Colt revolver from the bedroom upstairs. She had never fired a gun in her life, but desperation could substitute for experience. More importantly, she had advantages they didn't know about. She knew the house knew which floorboards creaked and which windows offered the best shooting angles. She knew where Harold kept his spare ammunition and which doors could be barricaded most effectively. And she had something else, something that might save not just her life, but Harold's entire legacy. The root cellar wasn't just where Harold stored his winter supplies. It was also where he kept his most important documents: the real deeds to his land, the authentic surveys that proved his legal ownership. And now, thanks to her discovery evidence of Matheson's long-standing conspiracy against the Parker family. If these men were here to destroy evidence and claim the ranch through forged documents, those papers would be crucial to exposing the truth. But first, she had to survive the night. The attack began with Jim's betrayal, just as she had overheard. The front door opened quietly, and she watched from the kitchen window as the young ranch hand stepped onto the porch, his face pale in the snow-reflected moonlight. "It's done," he called softly to the waiting riders. "Doors are unlocked, guns are moved. She's alone in the kitchen." "Good boy," came the reply from the man by the barn. "Matheson will remember this when he takes over. You'll have a place in the new order." Jim nodded, but Eliza could see the misery written across his features. Whatever hold Matheson had over him, it was strong enough to override his conscience, but not strong enough to make him happy about it. The 3 riders approached the house like hunters closing in on wounded prey. They expected to find a helpless woman cowering in the kitchen, easy prey for whatever Matheson had planned. They found something else entirely. Eliza had used her time well. The kitchen table was overturned and positioned to provide cover near the window. Pots of water were heating on the stove, not for cooking, but for weapons against anyone who got too close. Most importantly, she had retrieved Matheson's letter from the cellar and hidden it in her dress along with the most crucial land documents. If she was going to die tonight, she would make sure the truth died with her in a way that would eventually come to light. The first man through the door was the one who had been threatening Jim in the barn. He entered cautiously, gun drawn, expecting to find the house dark and quiet. Instead, he walked into a kitchen lit by flickering firelight and found himself face to face with a woman holding a rifle with steady hands. "That's far enough," Eliza said quietly. The man laughed, a sound like grinding stone. Well, well, the fat lady's got some fight in her. This might be more fun than I thought." I said, "That's far enough. Or what, you'll shoot me." His grin was predatory. "Lady, you're shaking so hard you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. Why don't you put that rifle down before you hurt yourself?" Eliza was shaking, but not from fear. She was shaking from rage at Jim's betrayal, at Matheson's conspiracy, at the casual cruelty of men who thought they could destroy lives without consequence. "You're right," she said calmly. "I probably couldn't hit the broadside of a barn." She pulled the trigger, and the rifle kicked like a mule. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the doorframe with a scream of pain and surprise. "But I can hit the middle of a kitchen from 6 feet away." The other 2 men burst through the door as their companion collapsed, but Eliza was already moving. She had positioned herself with multiple escape routes, and she used them now, darting from window to window and firing whenever she saw a clear target. The house erupted in chaos. Bullets shattered dishes and splintered wood, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. But Eliza had prepared for this too. She moved with purpose, using the furniture and architecture to her advantage. When one of the attackers tried to flank her through the front room, she was ready with a pot of boiling water that sent him screaming and clawing at his scalded face. When another tried to trap her in the kitchen, she used Harold's knowledge of the house. There was a second staircase, narrow and hidden, that led from the kitchen to the upper floor. But her greatest advantage was something the attackers hadn't counted on. She wasn't fighting to win. She was fighting to survive long enough for help to arrive. And that changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Because Harold Parker was already on his way home. Harold and Thomas had been riding the north boundary when they heard the first gunshots echoing across the valley. The sound carried clearly in the thin air, and both men knew immediately what it meant. Matheson, Harold said grimly, spurring his horse toward home. How many? Thomas asked, keeping pace beside his father. Don't know. But Miss Morgan's alone in that house, and Jim. Harold's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. God help us, I think Jim's been working for Edgar all along. They rode hard through the storm, guided by the flickering light of burning buildings in the distance. As they crested the final ridge, they could see the battle raging around the ranch house, muzzle flashes in the windows, men moving like shadows through the snow and flames, beginning to lick at the barn. But they weren't the only ones responding to the crisis. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb had been making his monthly rounds when the storm hit, and he'd taken shelter in Cedar Falls rather than risk the 40-mile ride back to Billings. When word reached town about suspicious riders and gunfire coming from the Parker Ranch, he had gathered a small posse of local men and fought his way through the blizzard. The three groups, Harold and Thomas from the North, Webb's posse from the south, and Matheson's remaining men scattered around the property, converged on the ranch house simultaneously. What followed was a running gun battle through a landscape turned hellish by fire and snow. Men fought half-blind in the storm, shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows. The barn blazed like a torch, casting dancing light across the white ground and making everything seem like a fever dream. But in the middle of it all, Eliza continued to fight from the house, her rifle cracking steadily as she provided covering fire for Harold and Thomas's approach. It was during this chaotic battle that Edgar Matheson finally made his appearance. He came riding out of the storm like an avenging angel, his horse's hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. At 55, he was still an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in the middle of a firefight. "Oh, Harold," he shouted, his voice carrying over the sound of gunfire. "Enough, let's settle this like men." Harold Parker stepped out from behind the wagon where he'd taken cover, his rifle held ready, but not raised. In the firelight, the two former friends faced each other across 30 years of accumulated grievances. "Edgar," Harold said quietly, "it didn't have to come to this, didn't it?" Matheson's voice was bitter with old pain. "You took everything from me, Harold. Our partnership, our friendship, our future. You left me with nothing but debts and the knowledge that my oldest friend thought I wasn't good enough to succeed honestly. That's not what, isn't it?" Matheson's gun came up, but not aimed at Harold. Instead, he pointed it toward the house where Eliza's silhouette was visible in the window. "You always were too soft, Harold. Too willing to take in strays and lost causes. Well, let's see how soft you feel when your good deed gets someone killed." The gun swung toward Eliza, and Harold saw murder in his old friend's eyes. But before Matheson could pull the trigger, another voice cut through the night. "Edgar, stop." Jim stepped out of the shadows by the barn, his young face streaked with tears and his hands empty of weapons. "This has gone far enough. I can't. I won't be part of murdering innocent people." Matheson's attention shifted to the young ranch hand. "You're having second thoughts, boy. Little late for that, don't you think?" "Maybe. But it's not too late to do the right thing." Jim's voice was steady despite his tears. "You can kill me if you want, but I won't help you hurt Miss Morgan or the Parkers anymore." "When he's touching," Matheson sneered. But you seem to have forgotten about your sister. What do you think happens to her when word reaches Helena that you betrayed me? Jim's face crumpled, but his voice remained firm. I'll have to trust that there are still good people in this world who will protect her. People like Harold Parker, who showed me kindness when I deserved none. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring with guns trained in multiple directions and death hanging in the balance. But it was Eliza who broke the deadlock. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, no longer hiding behind cover. In her hands, she held not a weapon, but a piece of paper Matheson's letter, the one that outlined his conspiracy against the Parker family. You want to know what Edgar Matheson really is? She called out her voice, carrying clearly across the snow-covered yard. He's a man who writes threatening letters to old friends, a man who bribes young cowboys and threatens their families, a man who forges documents and calls it business. She held up the letter where everyone could see it. I found this in Harold's cellar, along with other evidence of what you've been planning, Mr. Matheson. The robbery at the train station was reconnaissance. Jim was your spy feeding you information about the ranch's defenses. And tonight was supposed to be the night you eliminated witnesses and claimed what was never yours. Matheson's face went white with rage and fear. That letter represented his destruction, the end of everything he had built through intimidation and corruption. You don't understand what you're dealing with, woman, he snarled. I own half the judges in this territory. I've got men in positions of power from here to Helena. That piece of paper doesn't mean anything. Maybe not, Deputy Webb said, stepping into the light with his badge visible and his gun drawn. But this does. He held up a telegram, the paper slightly damp from snow, but still readable. Federal marshals arrested 3 territorial judges this morning on corruption charges. Seems someone's been selling verdicts to the highest bidder. They're very interested in talking to Edgar Matheson about his land acquisitions. For the first time since Eliza had known of him, Edgar Matheson had nothing to say. The game was over, and everyone knew it. But trapped animals were often the most dangerous, and Matheson was no exception. His hand tightened on his gun, and his eyes darted between Harold, Eliza, and the lawman who had just destroyed his empire. If I'm going down, he said with deadly calm, I'm taking someone with me. The gun swung toward Eliza again, and this time there was nothing but murder in Matheson's eyes. She had humiliated him, exposed him, destroyed everything he had worked for. If he was going to face justice, he would at least have the satisfaction of revenge. Time seemed to slow as Matheson's finger tightened on the trigger. Eliza stood motionless in the doorway, understanding that she had pushed the mad dog too far and was about to pay the ultimate price for her courage. The gunshot that followed was deafeningly loud in the crisp air, echoing off the mountains and rolling across the valley like thunder. But it wasn't Matheson's gun that fired. Thomas Parker stood 20 feet away, his rifle smoking in his hands, and his face pale with the realization of what he had just done. Edgar Matheson lay motionless in the snow, his unfired weapon fallen from his lifeless fingers. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of flames from the burning barn and the whisper of snow falling on hot metal. I'm sorry, Pa, Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. I know he was your friend once. Harold looked down at the body of the man who had been his partner, his friend, and finally, his enemy. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with sadness, but steady with resolve. He stopped being my friend the day he chose greed over honor's son. You did what had to be done. The aftermath of Edgar Matheson's death brought a strange quiet to the Parker Ranch. Deputy Webb and his posse spent the next 3 days documenting evidence, taking statements, and rounding up the surviving members of Matheson's organization. The scope of his criminal empire shocked even experienced lawmen, land fraud, extortion, cattle rustling, and intimidation spanning half the territory. Jim faced questioning about his role in the conspiracy, but his last-minute change of heart and Eliza's testimony about the threats against his sister earned him a measure of mercy. He would face charges, but Webb recommended leniency, given his cooperation and obvious remorse. "I don't expect forgiveness," Jim said to Harold on the morning he was to be taken to town for trial. "I betrayed your trust, endangered your family. I want you to know I'm sorry." Harold studied the young man's face for a long moment. "My Sarah used to say that a person's worst mistake doesn't have to define them as long as they learn from it and do better. You saved lives when it mattered most, Jim. That counts for something." Eliza found herself at the center of it all, her testimony crucial to building the case against Matheson's surviving associates. The documents she had retrieved from Harold's cellar provided the missing pieces that connected years of seemingly unrelated crimes. Federal marshals called her the key witness who had finally brought down one of the territory's most dangerous criminals. But more important to her than any official recognition was the change she saw in Thomas. He had grown quieter since the shooting. But it was a thoughtful quiet rather than a hostile one. The act of taking a life, even in defense of others, had forced him to confront his own prejudices and see past the shallow judgments that had blinded him to her worth. 3 weeks after the blizzard, as the roads finally began to open and life returned to something resembling normal, Thomas approached her in the kitchen where she was preparing breakfast. "Miss Morgan," he said formally, his hat in his hands, "could I have a word?" They sat at the kitchen table where she had tended wounds and planned defenses, where she had made the decision to fight rather than flee. In the morning light streaming through windows, she had fired from everything looked different, more peaceful, but also more precious. "I owe you an apology," Thomas began. "Several apologies, actually. Thomas, please let me finish." His voice was soft but determined. "What I said at the station, how I treated you since you arrived. There's no excuse for it. I judged you by appearance instead of character, by my expectations instead of your reality. I was cruel when I should have been kind. And I nearly cost all of us everything because of my blindness." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man raised on the frontier where emotions were kept as private as possible. "You saved our home, our lives, and our honor, and you did it for people who had given you nothing but rejection and cruelty. You showed more courage in one night than most people show in a lifetime, and you did it not because you had to, but because it was right." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different tears than she had cried that first night. These weren't tears of humiliation or despair, but of hope carefully nurtured and finally allowed to bloom. "I'd like to court you properly." Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength. "If you'll have me. Not because I need a wife or because you need a husband, but because I've come to care for you more than I thought possible. Because I want to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you." "And what kind of man is that?" Eliza asked gently. "The kind who sees people for who they are not, who he thinks they should be. The kind who values courage over appearance, character over convention. The kind who would be proud to stand beside you, not just in front of our friends and neighbors, but in front of God and the whole world." The kitchen fell silent except for the familiar sounds of the ranch, awakening cattle moving in the distance, horses in the corral, the whisper of wind through the pines. Outside, Montana was still harsh and unforgiving. But inside this house, something warm and precious was growing. "I'd like that very much," Eliza said simply. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and revealing the green grass beneath. The Parker Ranch recovered from the winter's damage stronger than before, and the territory slowly healed from the wound that Edgar Matheson's corruption had left. The first real test of the community's changed attitude toward Eliza came with Cedar Falls's revival of its Founders' Day celebration, a festival that had been suspended during Matheson's reign of terror. Harold suggested they attend, but Eliza hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," she admitted. People have long memories for the kind of spectacle I made at the train station. Then they'll also remember the kind of courage you showed when it mattered. Thomas replied firmly. Besides, you're part of this community now. You've earned the right to celebrate with everyone else. The festival was everything a frontier celebration should be: fiddle music and dancing competitions of skill and strength, food shared by families who had survived another hard winter together. But for Eliza, the most meaningful moment came when she was approached by Martha Henderson, the mayor's wife, who had been among the most vocal critics of Harold's decision to take her in. Miss Morgan. Martha said formally, her face flushed with embarrassment. I owe you an apology. What we did at the station, the way we treated you, it was shameful. You showed more courage and character than any of us had a right to expect. Mrs. Henderson, please let me finish. Martha's voice was shaking slightly. My husband would have lost his land to Matheson's schemes if you hadn't exposed his crimes. My children would have grown up in a place where might made right and honest folks had no protection. You didn't just save the Parker Ranch that night. You saved our whole way of life. Similar conversations happened throughout the day, as people who had once whispered behind their hands now approached with genuine respect and gratitude. It wasn't universal. Some people remained convinced that a woman of her circumstances couldn't possibly be entirely respectable. But for the first time in her adult life, Eliza felt like she truly belonged somewhere. The proposal came on a warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Thomas had been unusually quiet all day, and Eliza could sense his nervousness in the way he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. Eliza, he said finally, his voice unusually formal. I've been thinking about what we talked about that day in the kitchen. About becoming the kind of people we want to be, about building something together. What about it? Thomas slid out of his chair and dropped to one knee beside her, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket. It wasn't elaborate or expensive, but it caught the light of the setting sun and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. This was my mother's ring, he said quietly. Pa gave it to her when they were barely more than kids themselves, with nothing but hope and determination to build a life together. She wore it every day until she died, through good times and bad, through prosperity and hardship. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she could see everything that had brought them to this moment, the humiliation at the train station. And the long winter nights of growing understanding, the terrible night when she had fought for his family's survival, and all the small moments of kindness and respect that had grown between them, like wildflowers in harsh soil. She always said this ring would go to the woman who made me a better man than I thought I could be. Thomas continued. The woman who would stand beside me, not because she had to, but because she chose to. The woman who would be my partner in building something worthy of the sacrifices we've all made. So, Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the ring and then up at Thomas's face. The answer was yes, had been yes since that night by the fire, when she had seen past his prejudices to the good man underneath. But she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here, from Philadelphia to Montana, from rejection to acceptance, from despair to hope. Eliza Morgan. Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his face. Will you marry me? Not because either of us needs rescuing, but because we choose each other, because we want to build something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone. Yes, she said simply, and let him slide the ring onto her finger. Harold appeared in the doorway at that moment, as if he had been waiting for exactly this scene. His weathered face was creased with the kind of smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Well, he said with satisfaction, I guess we'd better start planning a wedding. The ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning, with the aspen trees turning gold on the mountainsides and the air sharp with the promise of winter. The church was packed not just with neighbors who had come to witness the wedding, but with people who had traveled from distant ranches to honor the woman who had become something of a legend in the territory. Children listened wide-eyed as their parents told them about the brave woman who had faced down Edgar Matheson's gang with nothing but a rifle and her determination to protect the people who had given her shelter. The story had grown in the telling, as such stories do, but the core remained true. Courage comes in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who matter most. But for Eliza, the most meaningful moment came when Harold walked her down the aisle. He moved with the quiet dignity of a man who had survived too much loss and found unexpected joy in gaining a daughter. As he placed her hand in Thomas's, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Take care of each other," he whispered to both of them. "That's all any of us can do in this life." When they exchanged vows, Eliza promised to stand by Thomas through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. Thomas promised to see her clearly, to value her for who she was, rather than who he had once thought she should be, and to never again let fear or prejudice make him cruel. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and as their lips met, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the rebuilt barn and fiddle music echoing off the rafters. People danced and laughed and told stories, celebrating not just a wedding, but the triumph of grace over cruelty of courage, over fear of love that was earned rather than merely promised. Jim was there, having served only 6 months in jail, thanks to his cooperation and the testimonies of those he had helped save. He was thinner and quieter than before, marked by his experiences, but Harold had given him work again, a second chance that he was determined not to waste. "Thank you," he said quietly to Eliza during a break in the dancing, "for speaking up for me at the trial, for giving me a chance to make things right." "We all deserve a second chance, Jim," she replied. "What matters is what we do with it." As the evening wound down and the guests began heading home, Eliza found herself standing on the front porch where she had spent so many evenings watching the sunset with Thomas and Harold. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and she could hear the cattle moving restlessly in the distance, disturbed by all the celebration. Thomas joined her, still wearing his wedding suit, but with his tie loosened and his formal manner relaxed. "Quite a day, Mrs. Parker?" Mrs. Parker. The name still felt strange on her tongue, but it was a good strangeness, like trying on clothes that fit perfectly after years of making do with garments that were wrong in every way that mattered. "Quite a year," she replied, thinking of everything that had brought them to this point. Harold appeared in the doorway, having changed out of his wedding clothes into more comfortable attire. "You know what Sarah would have said about all this?" "What?" Eliza asked. "She would have said that some people are meant to find each other, even if they have to go through hell to do it. She always believed that the best things in life were worth fighting for." Eliza smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart like seeds taking root. She had fought for this happiness, not with guns and violence, though that had been part of it, but with the quiet courage of refusing to give up when everything seemed hopeless. "I keep thinking about that night," Thomas said quietly. "When you stood up to Matheson's men, you could have run, could have saved yourself and left us to face the consequences of my cruelty. But you stayed. And this was my home," Eliza replied simply. "You and your father made it my home when I had nowhere else to go. How could I abandon it? That's what I mean." Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saw past my failures to something worth protecting. You believed in us before we believed in ourselves." They stood together in comfortable silence. 3 people who had found family in the aftermath of loss and conflict. The Montana night was vast and filled with possibilities, dangerous and beautiful in equal measure. "What happens now?" Eliza asked, not because she was worried about the future, but because she was curious about it for the first time in years. "Now we build something," Thomas said, taking her hand. Something that lasts. Something worthy of what you risked to save. We've got cattle to raise, land to work, neighbors to help when they need it. Harold added. We've got a life to live together, and maybe someday children to raise who'll know the value of courage and character over appearances. Maybe. Eliza agreed, feeling her heart swell with possibilities she had never dared imagine. In the distance, they could hear the last of the wedding guests making their way home, their voices carrying on the clear air as they called out final congratulations and wishes for happiness. The sound faded gradually, leaving only the eternal frontier symphony of wind through the pines and cattle settling for the night. Edgar Matheson was dead, his empire of corruption destroyed. The territory was healing under honest law and the protection of good people who were no longer afraid to stand up for what was right. Jim had learned the value of integrity and been given a chance to rebuild his life on a foundation of truth rather than fear. But most importantly, Eliza Morgan Parker was home. Not because she had changed to fit someone else's expectations, but because she had found people who could see her clearly, who valued her courage over her appearance, her character over her circumstances, her loyalty over any superficial judgment. 1 year later, Eliza stood at the same train station where her journey had begun, but this time she wasn't alone. Thomas waited beside her, his arm protective around her shoulders, as they watched another train pull into the station, with its cargo of hopes and dreams. Among the passengers was a young woman, not unlike Eliza, had been travel-worn, nervous, clutching a carpet bag, and looking around with the mixture of hope and fear that came with starting over in a strange place. The woman was thin, where Eliza was full dark, where Eliza was fair, but the expression in her eyes was achingly familiar. She looks lost, Thomas observed. She looks like she needs a friend. Eliza replied, recognizing something of her former self in the stranger's uncertain stance. They approached the young woman, who introduced herself as Rebecca Walsh, a seamstress from Boston, answering an advertisement for domestic help at one of the local ranches. But when they reached the meeting point, her prospective employer was nowhere to be found. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "Mr. Morrison was supposed to meet me here. His letter was very specific about the time and place." Eliza and Thomas exchanged a look. They had heard rumors about Jake Morrison, a man with a reputation for taking advantage of desperate women who had few alternatives. "Miss Walsh," Eliza said gently, "would you consider another position? We know of a family looking for help with household management and child care. Good people, fair wages, and honest work." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears of relief. "You would do that for a stranger?" "Someone did it for me once," Eliza said simply. It made all the difference. As they loaded Rebecca's luggage into their wagon, Eliza caught sight of her own reflection in the station window. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened, rejected bride who had stepped off a train in this same spot 2 years ago. This woman stood straight and confident, her face marked by sun and wind, and the kind of peace that came from knowing your own worth. This woman was loved and respected, not for what she looked like or what others expected her to be, but for who she truly was. The frontier night was vast and unforgiving, but she was no longer afraid of what it might bring. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, braver than she had ever hoped, and worthy of the love that had once seemed so impossible. Thomas took her hand as they helped Rebecca into the wagon, and together they headed home through the Montana darkness. Behind them, the train whistle faded into the distance, carrying with it the echoes of old journeys and the promise of new beginnings. At the Parker Ranch, where warmth waited in windows, golden with lamplight and love, had proven stronger than fear, stronger than prejudice, stronger than the worst that desperate people could do, another story was beginning. And Eliza Parker, who had once been nobody special to anyone, was finally, completely, eternally home.